Hi everyone, my name is Ian McLaughlin and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania, and typically on Sundays I like to try and prepare something a little bit more substantial, but I'll be honest, I've been entirely focused on applying for new jobs, and since there are very, very few jobs like those to which I'm applying, the applications can be pretty laborious and they need to all be uniquely tailored and so on. So all of this to say that I don't have a big story prepared for today, but there is a new development associated with the new coronavirus and the disease which it causes, called COVID-19, that I thought might be worth mentioning because I suspect it might not get all that much coverage in the press, at least not this specific story, and perhaps for good reason. But I figure that anyone who might end up watching or listening to this might be interested in the story. So there was a study that was published on in Cell, and it was made online, and it seemed like the journal rushed to put this study online, and they made it open access, which is pretty cool given how this industry tends to operate. So it kind of does reveal, this study reveals a few things about how this virus operates biologically, as well as a potential treatment for it that doesn't rely on vaccination. So I talked about the basic biology of this virus a few weeks ago, so I won't go into too much depth, but it's worth like a short review to get some context here. So this new coronavirus is a member of a family of other coronaviruses. Some of them are pretty consistently present and responsible for people catching what we tend to call colds, which, and I'll never miss an opportunity to discuss this zombie myth, the name cold invites the inaccurate notion that cold temperatures are what cause people to catch colds. Anyways, there are coronaviruses that are just part of the sort of general landscape of the things that we tend to catch that make us mildly sick, not necessarily putting us on our back and giving us severe fevers, but, makes us feel gross. Well, every now and then, a coronavirus crops up that causes a more severe reaction. So past coronaviruses like the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, or SARS, and the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, or MERS, are two examples. And so both of those are zoonotic, meaning that they were transmitted from non-human animals to humans. And they result in pretty severe illnesses. And so SARS began in 2002 in China and resulted in just over 8,000 confirmed cases and just under 800 fatalities. And it's thought that it originated in horseshoe bats in China. And so that doesn't mean, however, that transmission was direct from bats to humans. There can be several intermediary animals that facilitate the transmission of a virus like this, particularly once it arrives in animals that inhabit areas that more closely are associated with humans. And so, there have been some misconceptions that have circulated based on a misunderstanding of how viruses like these can circulate. So, once again, it didn't necessarily originate with a bat to human transmission. Okay, so this new coronavirus emerged in December of 2019, so a few months ago. And there are reports that early infections were linked to the Huanan seafood market. And there's speculation that it may have resulted from contact between non-human animals and humans, right? So now, called COVID-19, the disease spreads super rapidly in China, and it seems to be pretty closely related to the SARS virus that arose in 2002. And so I cited this handy-dandy tracker that's been provided by Johns Hopkins School of Engineering, which was also published in the Lancet, which is a medical journal. And so here's what it looked like on February 9th. I'm sorry. This was just about a month ago. And then here's the tracker, that same tracker as of last night, pretty late last night. Obviously the numbers have gone up a fair bit. And there's, always a concern regarding how confident we ought to be in the data emerging from China. But the thing to which it's worth devoting some attention will be, moving forward, that yellow other locations curve. And so here I have a bigger version of it here so you can see it easier. Given the expansion of cases within the US and the proximity of this expansion to my beloved Philadelphia and the potential exposure of my 1-year-old, it's something to which I've been paying close attention. And so the New York Times provided a handy, more granular tracker of reported cases in the United States, which you can see here. Here, I can get rid of those two. Yeah. Okay, so you might forgive me for being a little bit United States centric because it's where I, as well as my extended families on both sides, live. But in the interest of accuracy, this virus seems to have arrived at basically every continent except Antarctica. And so, okay, so back to this study. So to infect cells, viruses need to enter the cells. And they need to gain that entry by some mechanism, some feature of the cells and some feature of the virus. And so different viruses, therefore, can enter different types of cells in the body. And so in the case of these coronaviruses, and this coronavirus in particular, they're able to infect lung cells. And so, the biology here gets a little bit nitty gritty, but there are a bunch of proteins that need to interact with other proteins and ultimately receptors on cells in the body. And so in the brain, you might have heard of molecules called neurotransmitters, things like serotonin, dopamine, GABA, and so on. Well, they're only like biologically meaningful or interesting because they bind receptors. And receptors are proteins on neurons that, when bound, result in changes within the neuron that make them more or less likely to fire impulses or action potentials, which is what we call impulses in neuroscience. And there's different definitions of what precisely an impulse is, but moving forward, action potential and impulses for our purposes will be synonymous. And so while biological signaling pathways outside of the brain, like muscle cells, hormone signaling, things like estrogen or testosterone or insulin, or more relevantly, lung cells don't necessarily fire action potentials or impulses. The process of molecules interacting with receptors is still central to the biology of those cells. And so, the only reason I bring all of this up is because the progress described in this study emerges entirely from a very specific interaction between this novel coronavirus, which causes COVID-19, and a specific receptor on cells that are vulnerable to infection by the virus in the human body. So coronaviruses, this family of viruses of which this new COVID-19 is the latest offender, has a protein called spike. So the name of the protein is spike. And part of this protein needs to bind to some component of its target cell. This same protein is also required for the entry of the virus into the cell. Okay, so it's not just like binding to the cell, but it's also entering the cells that matters here. And so once the viral particles get inside of cells, that's when they get down to business and they start replicating. And so in the case of SARS from 2002, it required a specific receptor called the angiotensin converting enzyme 2, right? So ACE2 or ACE2. It required that to enter cells. It then uses an enzyme with one of those like unforgivable biomedical science names, TMPRSS2, to get into the cells and then ultimately get down to business, right? And so that abbreviation stands for transmembrane protease, serine 2, okay, which I know is like a thoroughly captivating name. Don't worry about precisely what it is. And so that was SARS in 2002. So what about this novel coronavirus? Well, we're still sort of in preliminary stages of understanding its biology at like an equally granular level, though things are moving fast. But the novel coronavirus is quite similar to the SARS virus. And, part of the innovation in this recent set of experiments was demonstrating that it seems quite likely that this novel coronavirus also uses that same ACE2 receptor that SARS uses. So in other words, it seems like this new coronavirus seems to rely on the same things, or many of the same things, that the SARS virus from 2002 does to infect cells. But what's cooler about this study is that they try out a drug, or they explore a drug that's already been clinically established as an effective inhibitor of one of the things that these viruses need to infect cells, TMPRSS2. So in other words, this drug interferes with one of the most pivotal points in the entry of virus into cells in the human body. So, it's worth noting that the similarity in the dependence on those same receptors and, the same factors between these two viruses is basically a prediction based on the similarity in amino acids between the old SARS virus and the new coronavirus, which causes COVID-19. And so as far as predictions go, it is a prediction, but as far as predictions go, it's about as probable as they get. And so viruses are, pretty simple things. And we know these are highly related viruses. And so they're not just like guessing because the viruses came from similar parts of the world or anything like that. Regardless of all of that, more direct biological comparisons need to be done in like biological systems. But there are also some further interesting interactions between these viruses and biological systems within the human body. beyond, and the receptors that we're discussing, the ACE2 receptor and TMPRSS2. But I don't think it's going to be particularly edifying for folks outside of science. But anyways, the group highlights a drug called Camostat, or Camostat mesylate. And it may be a valuable resource when treating patients infected with this novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19. And so this is a drug that's been used to treat some forms of cancer, liver or kidney disease, or pancreatitis. And so, that's pretty helpful because we know at least a little bit about what happens when the human body is exposed to this drug. And so, the same couldn't be said for a completely novel, newly invented drug that's never been exposed to humans. And so, while that's not necessarily like a critical consideration when you're trying to create new treatments for infections, it's, particularly helpful when there happens to be like a probable pandemic on our doorsteps, or I guess more accurately, like our doorknobs. But it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of these studies of the virus are going to be a bit more rushed to print than would typically be the case, or at least that's likely. For obvious reasons, right? There's a rush to make the findings of experiments available to other scientists as quickly as possible. In the interest of moving forward, biomedically as quickly as possible. This paper still went through peer review, and I'm sure it was a fairly stringent peer review at that. I just have to assume, given the incredible interest in this virus. But, that's just worth keeping in mind. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that this drug will be particularly effective in preventing infection with the virus. And it's worth noting that treatment with a drug like this is unlikely to even be necessary for, many people at least. But since this will be the first time that any people have been exposed to this virus, it's always good to add new tools to the armamentarium available to confront a virus like this. By the way, armamentarium is one of my favorite words. And it sounds like it might be a military word, but it actually means specifically, quote, a collection of resources available or utilized for an undertaking or file of activity. But its primary definition applies to the equipment, methods, and pharmaceuticals used in medicine. So it's pretty cool. So the military, has their armaments. Biomedical scientists have our armamentarium. Anyway, so I could go on and on, but I really just to focus on this study, and it's an interesting series of findings because it's a fascinating development that there might be a drug that can help to halt the progression of infection with this virus in those who are vulnerable or exposed, right? And so, before we start the live half, just some notes I think are worth keeping in mind to be optimistic regarding our ability to confront this, just from like a public health perspective. So first, the culprit of these cases of severe pneumonia symptoms was very rapidly identified in China. And not only that, but China did the right thing and provided the virus's identity, as well, as its genetic sequence to the world of scientists, which, played actually a pretty significant role in the paper we just discussed. If they didn't have those sequences available, they wouldn't have been able to make those comparisons to, the past SARS virus. And just for some context, the reason this is worth recognizing is that it took years to finally figure out that HIV was what was causing AIDS. Years. And so just as an example of some of the impressive research that's being done as we speak, there's a group of scientists or geneticists really who are tracking not only the virus as it spreads, but also the genetic mutations that occur as it spreads. And so here's an example of what some of their data look like. I know it's a little noisy, but you can check out these data on a website called nextstrain.org, just one word, nextstrain. And so, scientists have been posting data super rapidly. And, so we almost have like a real-time tracker on not only where the virus is spreading, but also the unique identities of the viruses as they arise. And so, why is that helpful? It can be helpful because it can help us to pin down the origins of various new cases in new countries with far greater accuracy than just statistics, right? Than just like following infections on a map. And so, I'll give you an example of the first case of novel coronavirus infection in Washington state, here in the United States, was identified about 6 weeks ago. But they sequenced that virus, and they found that it had a specific viral mutation that was shared with a more recent infection. And it suggests that it may be that the virus may have actually been spreading within the United States for much longer than we thought. And that's just one example. But overall it suggests that like many countries have been exposed to multiple introductions of this virus. At least it might be the case. That might be the case, and this also includes throughout Europe. So another example is some examples within Brazil. And so it turned out that after evaluating the genetic information from 2 cases of coronavirus infections, the viral sequences weren't as closely related as one might anticipate if they were both derived from exposure to the same original virus. And so, in other words, these 2 people might have caught the coronavirus from being exposed from 2 separate original carriers of the virus. And, okay, so who cares? Why does that matter? Because with this kind of information, not only, will we be able to more accurately pin down the origins of this virus, but it'll also help us to keep tabs on what kind of public health solutions are effective, and equally important, what kind of solutions have been ineffective. Okay, and so another point of optimism. So there's some concern regarding the availability and the frequency of testing for the virus, but there is an effective test that's available. And that can make a huge difference in confronting a pathogen like this that produces symptoms that can be sort of difficult to rule out other potential pathogens that might be causing these symptoms. Okay, so another point of optimism, third. So pretty standard hygienic practices can significantly mitigate the likelihood that you'll just randomly catch this virus. I'm sure, as everybody's already heard, just effective hand washing will cut that likelihood down significantly. And, we can clean surfaces effectively with like a fairly mundane combination of like ethanol, bleach, and maybe hydrogen peroxide. And so, the point being, it's not like we need to, set up some kind of like mining operation on Venus to like find something that'll kill this virus. You probably have those things in your house already. And so, fourth, not all demographics face an equivalent risk of severe reactions to this virus. And, I'm sure that's cold comfort to folks who are in those risk groups, which basically are older members of our societies. But, it does help us to understand and project what we can expect here. And then fifth, I only talked about one article on COVID-19, but there are tons and tons that are coming out at a rapid pace. And so, it's not like there's only 3 labs in the world on the case for this virus or that have the expertise to study this virus. A large community of scientists are chipping away at understanding the best ways we can respond to this virus from like public health and medical and like biomedical perspectives. So, there's some cause for optimism. And, we have tools available to us, scientific tools, and potentially like medical tools, already available to us that were not available during certainly like earlier rises of severely, fatal or severely infectious pathogens. And so, we are in a position to respond much more rapidly and effectively than, one might typically expect. And so, okay. So that's the story I have for you today. Let's start the live half. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And on YouTube, I just talked about a new study that came out that may have identified a novel treatment for COVID-19, or what the new coronavirus causes. And importantly, it doesn't rely on vaccination, which is pretty cool. It could be quite handy. Particularly for folks who are like vulnerable to the more severe reactions to this virus, or who are at like a high, frequency of exposure. So you can find that by typing in your YouTube search bar, Ian, or like anthropoid brain Ian or something like that. Some combination of those terms, and you'll be able to check it out. Oh, I forgot to do this. I always forget. So yeah, you can check that out. It's a cool study. Wait, let me... And yeah, it's a cool study. And also what's important about this study is that the drug that they have sort of evaluated for potential efficacy is already used in medicine. And it's already been pretty well established. And it seems to be able to, it should be able to interfere with like one of the central biological interactions that the virus has to go through to be able to enter cells basically in the lungs. and so could potentially be pretty effective in preventing infection. What's going on here? It seems like I'm not even allowed to, or able to, log in. How strange. Is there a problem? Maybe connection isn't working out for people. This is concerning. Sorry, everybody. It seems like we might be having a little bit of technical difficulties here. This doesn't usually happen. It says I'm connected. Yeah, seems like there's something wrong. For everybody that's in here, can you tell me if... tell me if you're here. Can you tell me if you can see anything? Weird. I don't see any reason that this would be happening on my end. Let's see. Yeah. Huh. I'm not seeing any comments. I'm just seeing a black screen. Okay. Well, it's interesting that I could see your comment. What is going on here? Maybe I should start this over again. That's so odd. Because it seems like it went out on Twitter. And it's kind of frustrating. Yeah. It doesn't seem to be working. Sorry, everybody. I know this is like thoroughly captivating stuff. Yeah, maybe I should try again. Okay, I'm going to start and stop again. So see you in a second. Odd. Okay, let's see that. Okay. Sorry, I know this YouTube is like ridiculous right now. Boom. Oh, of course, this always happens. It's a very charming aspect of... This is a great angle, I know. Ugh. No, let's see. Oh, it seems like it's having trouble initializing the video stream. That's odd. Oh, I should probably change this too. Let's do that. It's kind of tough to have a live half when there's no live component to it. Yeah. Huh. It's the first time this has ever happened. Let's see what happens if I do this. Interesting. Okay, well, I'll tell you what. Let's do this. And let's do this. Ugh. It's super frustrating. Okay. Okay, maybe that helped. Put this back in there. Ugh. And let's put this right here. And let's make sure that everything seems back to normal. Okay, now let's see if this might work. Boop. Boop, boop. Okay, this seems to have worked. Okay. Ooh, that's awesome. All right. Starting again, my name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And let me know if there's any problems this time. If you're unable to see me. So on YouTube, I just discussed a new study that came out that may have identified a novel treatment for the novel coronavirus that, most interestingly, does not seem to rely upon vaccination. And that's very exciting because it's tough to develop vaccines. While we're a little bit further along in a vaccine development than we would be typically, what would be great is if there was just a drug that was basically ready to go that could help reduce the likelihood of infection for people, particularly for people who are like in vulnerable positions, in like vulnerable demographics, and people who are like very frequently being exposed to the virus. And what's really cool about this study is that they seem to have, or that the drug has already been in use in medicine to treat things like pancreatitis, certain cancers. So if you're interested in that, I also did a sort of update on what we know about the virus. You can find my YouTube, and you type in the search bar like Ian Anthropoid Brain, and you may or may not find it. Okay. Should we be worried that the latest Japanese study that the coronavirus could affect the brain? So I haven't seen that specific study. There is always an interaction. Well, there is a sort of more recently identified and characterized interaction between, the immune system, inflammatory signaling outside of the brain, and, typical signaling within the brain. And there's been some like really interesting relationships between chronic inflammation and psychiatric conditions. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know if perhaps that's what they're discussing, or if there's something more specific. But it's also worth keeping in mind when it comes to studies that are going to be coming out about this virus is that things are moving really rapidly. Obviously, there's, an intense interest to get science out as quickly as possible. And that doesn't mean that anybody's suspended peer review or anything like that. But, there is just a bit more of a rush. And so, it's worth, just keeping that in mind. And that is something that's distinct about how we're able to respond from a public health perspective to this virus versus past viruses, in that, there's many labs that are in a great position to be able to study it. And we already know quite a bit more about this virus than we would have in like the past. Like the not only was the identity of this virus very rapidly established, but the groups that did identify it in China did, a great thing in releasing basically everything they knew about it, including the genetic sequences, which basically enabled the study that I talked about over on YouTube. So yeah, you can check that out. But anyways, yeah, the way that we come to a sort of consensus in science is when multiple studies all converge on a similar finding using different methods and different groups. So yeah, okay. I tune in every week. Well, thank you so much. I'm honored. Rib bands. Could the virus be overhyped? Well, I mean, so another thing that I talked about on the YouTube were some sources of optimism when it comes to this virus. And so, things are moving super rapidly, both, for two reasons. First of all, the virus seems to be rather infectious and can spread more easily than other viruses. And also part of it is because it doesn't cause a severe reaction in everybody. So that means that like people won't necessarily isolate themselves or stay home from work or stay home, not go out to, a museum or something like that, which we were considering doing with my daughter. But because it's not such a severe reaction and they feel like they can just weather that storm. But some people are at a risk of responding very, severely. And so, yeah. So, I mean, there are some features of this that warrant some, preparation and, not panic or anything like that, but just, some forethought. But I'm definitely seeing like, a lot of, particularly like the graphics that you'll see on news, which, they always do. So it's not like it's unique to this, but like, bleeding red letters, coronavirus, and, that's over the top for sure. So yeah, but, so there's always a risk of overreacting. And, news has to fill 24 hours of content. And so, they're going to do that. And anything that elicits a significant emotional reaction is gold in news and in social media. So, hey, Joy, good to see you. Okay. What happens if you get scared half to death twice? Well, you're just scared half to death both times. That's how math works. Okay. My favorite side. Well, thank you. Beautiful. Okay. How can I retrain my brain to do more productive things? That's obviously a huge topic. And it really depends upon what precisely you're considering to be productive, right? Like, for example, practicing guitar, 12 hours a day would make me a far better guitarist, but that wouldn't be particularly productive from a career standpoint, So, there's different things. But an interesting feature of the human brain is that we have this big old fancy frontal lobe, basically, specifically like the prefrontal cortex and, adjacent anatomical structures that enable us this unique capacity, well, not completely unique capacity, but amplified capacity to make the choice to do the hard thing because we know that it'll deliver greater rewards in the future than the easier thing, which would deliver us rewards immediately. So in other words, like, when you decide to engage a task that is more difficult, but you suspect will yield better returns, you're exercising that circuitry. You're exercising that network of neurons. And, there is some research to suggest that the greater frequency that you do that basically you inhibit those impulses to derive a reward in the moment, the more frequently you do that, the better at it you get. And so, there is something to be said for applying that kind of, whatever you consider to be productive, on a regular basis. It's sort of like exercising, right? Exercising once is better than none, but really the nutrition is in exercising regularly. Did you make the Bible? I did not make the Bible. I could not put that on my CV. I'm putting a lot of stuff on my CV, but writing the Bible, unfortunately, is not one of them. Why should this matter? These are strange technicalities. I'm not quite, that was actually a very non-technical response, in fact. And I always find it difficult to identify the line between going too granular and, going too broad. But for a thing like, how can I be more productive? I think a broad response is better than, describing the inhibitory projections from the prefrontal cortex to limbic regions that drive a lot of the sort of impulse in the moment, because, why do you care, right? I think what somebody's more interested in is, okay, what's the practical utility for me? Okay. Are you Jesus? I'm not Jesus. Hi from Cherry Hill. Hello from Philadelphia, nearby. You're sort of in the neighborhood. Afternoon, Ian. How are you and the family doing? Well, thank you for asking, Ben. We're doing great. Unfortunately, so I went to the park with the girls yesterday, and my daughter loves the swings. She just loves the swings. And there's a park nearby, and they have normal swings for big girls and boys, but they also have the baby swings that are basically like not saddles. They're like harnesses almost that they sit in, right? To prevent them from falling backwards. And she loves these swings, and she's also getting pretty good at walking, but she's in this phase where she's a little bit overconfident in her ability to walk. And so unfortunately she took a bit of a spill yesterday, and she has the cutest nose. My wife and I just can't get over her nose. And unfortunately she scraped it a little bit. So she has a little, what do they call it? Like a little raspberry? I don't know what they call it, on her nose. And so, we've put various ointments on it and everything, but yeah, that was kind of sad. And, but she was a total trooper. So the park is near a train, and so, we just picked her up. We went over to the train, and she was like, wow. And then, what's that? Train. No, I say, is that a train? And she goes, choo-choo. She's just like, oh. So, yeah, a little bit of advice that I've just learned as a parent is if the baby, she's a 1-year-old, by the way. So if the baby's crying and something caused him or her to cry, and it's in a specific environment, if you just remove them from that environment and then expose them to new stimuli, it's like a reset, and they forget, I suppose, why they were crying. Or here's my theory, is that the signaling that drives that emotional reaction that's making them cry becomes dominated by the novelty of new environmental stimuli. So that's my my neuroscience explanation. Hello, Charlie. So yeah, is it true children aren't getting it? So I don't know that we can be, confident to the level in like the epidemiology and biology, confident to the level where it's like, we know that kids don't get it. But there do seem to be some pretty confidently characterized demographic features of risk groups for this novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19. And it does seem to be the case that, it's very frequently the case that, particularly young people and rather older people, tend to always be a little bit more vulnerable to infectious disease or viral and bacterial infection and stuff like that. But it does seem to be the case that older members of society are at a greater risk than other demographics. But, that doesn't mean that everybody younger than 65 is invulnerable, right? It's still absolutely prudent, not only for yourself to, wash your hands for 30 or even longer seconds, making sure you get in between the fingers and your thumbs. And, studies have shown, or evaluations have shown that the fingernails are almost never effectively cleaned. So one of my moves is towards the end, do the, and then I do a little, that kind of a motion, just my fingertips. But anyway, so that's good for you to avoid you getting the infection, because there's no way to know, there might be some demographic features of how people react to this virus that have nothing to do with age. Some folks just might be, for whatever reason, vulnerable. Maybe your immune system isn't as robust as you would suspect or expect given your age. And so, it's just good practice, not only for you, but also, I don't know, if you're anything like me, quite a few people who are, above the age of 65, whom you loved deeply, and just because it doesn't affect you very, very much, it could infect them. And so it's just good practice. Be a good citizen, good biomedical citizen. Oh, we're getting a call. Okay, now let's see if this works. Gotta get my book ready. Okay, Natif, I believe is your name. Is that your name? And if so, where are you calling from?
Hi, man. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking English, but I'm from Saudi Arabia.
Cool, from Saudi Arabia. What's on your mind?
Yes. What? Can you speak? I'm not speaking English very well.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Thank you.
No, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
It's. I wish I spoke more languages. I was debating whether or not I should include functional Spanish on my CV and resume, and my wife was like, "Please, get out of here with that." Yeah, I would love to be able to speak more languages, particularly non-Romance languages, but alas, I cannot. All right, what makes it that a person is more capable of understanding when you speak something rather than reading? That is super interesting. And I don't have a precise answer for you. So basically, if you'll permit me to restate, I think you're suggesting that it's easier to understand somebody's meaning when you're talking to them, or at least seeing them speak, compared to when you're just reading it, like on a paper or on a screen. I think there is something to that. And human communication is far more complicated than just words. And of course, the written word, one of the biggest revolutions in cognitive evolution, but you're limited to just specifically symbols that represent thoughts, emotions, experiences, and so on. Human communication extends far beyond that. There are, one of my favorite features of communication research is prosody or prosody. Thank you for the super heart, Elizabeth. I really appreciate it. And prosodic components of language are those that don't have to do with the actual spoken words themselves, but rather things like intonation, facial expression, which is a gigantic component of human communications. I'll just give you an example. If I say I went to the bar and I talked to somebody new, that's how I said it. Versus, I went to the bar and I talked to someone new. There's a completely different kind of implicit message there. Just because I angled my head down, I cocked my my eyebrow up, and I spoke in a sort of menacing tone. And so that written down, that they mean the same thing, but in conversation you get the benefit of evaluating somebody's meaning beyond just the words they're saying. And so And also, of course, I mean, this is one of the reasons I love doing this kind of communication, is because you get an instant feedback, right? And, you know, if somebody says, you know, I don't understand what you're saying, or they ask a question in a different way, if I were to just write a response, like on Twitter or on Quora or Reddit or something, you know, I'm hoping that I write it in a way that's intelligible or coherent. But in this way, if you ask the question in a different, you know, if you phrase it differently or you emphasize different components of the question, you're revealing, you know, weaknesses in the way that I'm communicating. So I think that is super helpful. But I'm sure there's even more to that. I'm sure there's even like additional reasons that spoken communication tends to deliver greater calories, right, when trying to understand one another. Being over 60 and under 65, insurance won't authorize pneumonia shot. Would it be benefit to get? So I'm not a physician, you know, I'm a scientist. I've not seen any physicians, you know, CDC, WHO, suggest that people ought to take any kind of like prophylactic treatments for, I assume you're referring to the coronavirus or, you know, the COVID-19. Rather, you know, it's a respiratory virus. And so, you know, just mitigating the likelihood that you'll be exposed, or that the vulnerable cells in your body will be exposed, is the best practice. Now, what I talked about on YouTube is a recent study that came out that identified a potential drug, potential medication that's already in use in medicine that may be able to interfere, even if the virus is exposed, to, you know, lung cells, essentially, that this medication might be able to just interfere with the specific interactions that are necessary for the virus to actually gain entry to cells, thereby preventing, you catching the illness. But, you know, that wouldn't be, it would be totally absurd for somebody who's, you know, not in a particularly vulnerable demographic or not being regularly exposed to infected patients. It would just be a silly thing to do. You know, you should just focus on washing your hands, you know, cleaning surfaces a little bit more frequently, particularly if you live in like an apartment like I do. And, you know, you have guests coming, you know, if you have, you know, friends coming over, particularly if you have folks who are, you know, a bit older, or if you have a baby like I do, you know, just ask your guests to wash their hands. I mean, that's something that we did just to begin with, because particularly under the age of 1, you know, kids don't get their measles vaccines until they're 1 year old. And, you know, they have a totally novel immune system. They haven't been exposed to as many things as adults. And so we always just asked everybody, just first thing you do when you come in, just wash your hands. And not only does that help to protect my baby, but, you know, it also mitigates the likelihood that they might spread, the flu or a rhinovirus, which also causes, you know, the cold, what we call a cold, or other coronaviruses, which have been around for a long time, which we know cause a sort of, a milder response that we also just call a cold. You ask your guests to wash your hands. Yes. I mean, we say because of the baby, just because, you know, we have a small apartment. The baby gets to touch pretty much whatever she wants. And so, yeah. Oh, and the other thing you can do is, you know, just wipe down doorknobs and things that like a bunch of people touch. And the other nice thing about where we're at is that you can just use like alcohol, bleach, and sort of pretty standard things that you probably already have in your house. Okay, so Zen Squad, I believe, if that's your name or if that's what you like to be called, where are you calling from?
Hi, it's Christine here from Switzerland. Can you hear me?
From Switzerland?
Yes.
Oh, very cool. So Christine from Switzerland. What's on your mind?
Yeah. Hi, Ian. Hi.
Hi.
I have a quick question about the olfactory system. And in the process of dying, I'm studying palliative care. I want to know if it's proven or we have any evidence of in what order, like when the body's shutting down, how long can you actually, does your olfactory system actually work, or how long does your brain register? Do you have any information on that?
That's really interesting. So, I mean, are we talking about like people who are in sort of terminal, facing terminal disease, and are they like in a coma, or are they just sort of ill and?
Whoa, I haven't really considered. I suppose both. I'm studying aromatherapy, and I'm going to be specializing in palliative care. That's very interesting. So and that's really fascinating. Also, within a coma is also. But I was thinking just during the process of dying.
Yeah.
Is there a difference then in the coma patients and awake patients?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, so here's how I would think about this. It's a very interesting topic. So olfaction, it's just for everybody that's not familiar, the olfactory system refers to our ability to smell and taste. And it is a really interesting sensory modality. The other sensory modalities are things like vision, or your ability to hear or touch or feel acceleration, which is one that doesn't get a lot of attention. But anyways, olfaction, there is some evolutionary biology to suggest that olfaction might have been the first sensory system that evolved on Earth. It's a very simple sensory system. Basically, all it is that you have receptors that bind molecules that are, inhabiting whatever substrate you're in. For us, it's air, but for aquatic creatures, it's the water. And then as our ancient evolutionary ancestors evolved, then other sensory systems came online. And part of the reason for that theory exists is that the olfactory system has a unique anatomy in that, in addition to having parts of the brain devoted to olfaction, it also sends projections to a unique constellation of other brain regions, including limbic system associated regions, which broadly speaking regulate mood. And then they also send projections to memory associated parts of the brain. And this isn't necessarily the case, for example, for the visual system. Or other sensory systems. Okay, so specifically with regards to people who are facing terminal illnesses, let's just say broadly, I'm not aware of any broad algorithm that would predict the deterioration of sensory systems comparatively. In other words, I don't know that I'm certainly not aware of any evaluation that determines this, but I also think that it would be important to keep in mind that there are different things that cause terminal illnesses, cancer, stroke, a variety of things. And depending upon the nature of those illnesses, different brain regions are likely to be more or less affected. So for example, if somebody had a stroke and they're experiencing, subsequent strokes, depending upon where in the brain that stroke occurred, you can have very severe deterioration of vision, whereas other sensory systems remain largely intact, or, vice versa, it could be that the olfactory system is primarily affected. But okay, so there's that. There's also, as people get older, the olfactory system does tend to just deteriorate. It doesn't necessarily go away completely, but just generally speaking, we get less effective at distinguishing different tastes and smells, and that is well, I guess I won't go there, but so that's just that is a constant just as we get older, and so if I were in the position of somebody who's caring for somebody in terminal care or something like that, I would assume that the olfactory system is quite likely still intact. It's probably a little bit less sensitive to novel smells than somebody, let's say my age, or perhaps if you're maybe you're around my age, somebody our age, and I wouldn't necessarily tailor exposure to olfactory stimuli according to their age or whether or not they have some terminal illness. But it is an interesting topic that you bring up, and I imagine there might be some research that might speak specifically to this, but that's broadly how I would think about olfactory stimuli for palliative care. That's really interesting.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks for calling in. Christine from Switzerland. Very cool. I have a friend that did her postdoc in Switzerland, in Geneva. Okay, can an MRI help diagnose occasional dizziness? Well, so here's what an MRI is. MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. And so it's basically like if you went into the doctor and your doctor was worried that maybe you have some kind of damage to your joints or maybe a broken bone or some kind of cardiovascular abnormality, what MRI can help us to do is to see the finer features of human anatomy, right? So specifically like the structures of the body, and that includes the brain. But MRI cannot reveal to us, the status of specific neurons. It can reveal to us the status of broad anatomical regions. And so it can be helpful, for example, to see if somebody has had a stroke, because a stroke will result in a pretty substantial change in a large, well, if it's detectable, if it's a major stroke, in a relatively large number of neurons. And that can help us to identify, okay, where in the brain did a stroke occur, and where in the brain might it have occurred? And so, yeah, so when it comes to like occasional dizziness, it would really depend upon what's causing the dizziness. There's a bunch of different things, everything from like low blood pressure, an insulin issue, vertigo, some kind of side effect of a medication can cause dizziness. Even just being chronically tired can in some cases cause dizziness. And so, if I'm not a physician, if let's say if you were to come into my lab as a scientist and you're like, hey, I have this occasional dizziness, the first thing that I would do wouldn't be to try out an MRI, because my suspicion would be that, particularly if it's not like a chronic, dizziness, if it's just occasional, my suspicion would be that it's a more molecular, or let's say a more cell-based disruption rather than a broad anatomical abnormality. What are your thoughts on a cure for Alzheimer's? Really interesting topic. Oh, actually, okay, we have a caller. I will get to Alzheimer's medications. Oh no, let's do it. We literally just lost that caller. Feel free to call back in. I'll keep my eye open. So Alzheimer's disease is one of the leading causes of dementia. And many things cause dementia, but Alzheimer's is the most frequent cause. And Alzheimer's, we are pretty sure, results from the aggregation of two things: amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Amyloid beta plaques on the outsides of neurons, gunking up the outsides; neurofibrillary tangles on the insides of neurons, doing the same inside. Now, we've studied Alzheimer's disease for a very long time now. And it is one of this just frustrating and elusive conditions, because we know quite a bit about the basic biology of Alzheimer's, even certain genes that are involved, and certain specific biochemical pathways that seem to be necessary for the accumulation of those plaques. And we've also attempted several different strategies to potentially cure Alzheimer's, the most recent of which being the use of antibodies to target those plaques, and ultimately with the goal of clearing them away. Because the theory would be, if these plaques are what cause Alzheimer's disease, then let's get rid of them, and maybe we'll thereby cure the disease. And this has been tried several times over the years. I believe in like the late 90s it was tried, and then again in the 2000s, and then whatever, it's multiple times. If you think that the concept is brilliant, leverage essentially the immune system to attack this molecular problem. Unfortunately, I believe it was I think it was I think it was Genentech that attempted a new, and I should say, like, in the early attempts of this strategy, people responded kind of unfavorably, and there were some pretty adverse reactions. People developed high fevers and stuff like that. And so that was part of the reason that treatment had to be abandoned. And that's generally speaking been the case. But this recent attempt, like I think it was last year, basically, just was unsuccessful. And so the field is sort of back to the drawing board, and trying to come up with novel treatments. When I first read about that strategy, I was like, that's just brilliant. There's different ways to activate the immune system to attack amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Amyloid beta plaques are really the ones that they targeted, but it's brilliant. When we learn about Alzheimer's disease, what do we learn about? Amyloid beta plaques, neurofibrillary tangles. And so, I think a lot of folks were quite optimistic, but unfortunately it didn't work. And so that has sort of thrown the field into this quagmire where, for a long time, we had, the amyloid beta plaque hypothesis of Alzheimer's was the sort of prevailing hypothesis, the concept being that you get these plaques, and then that might be what causes the accumulation of neurofibrillary tangles. And as time went on, it sort of complexified, and we, now the prevailing hypothesis is that both are necessary and caused by separate things, and if you get both, then you get Alzheimer's disease. But now, even if you clear at least some of the plaques, there's no cognitive improvement Okay, so then are they just a byproduct of something more upstream that's occurring that's actually causing Alzheimer's, and that, you know, there's an indication of Alzheimer's by the presence of plaques and tangles, but maybe there's something else that is causing all of it to happen that's, you know, we still have yet to discover. That's possible. But I think broadly speaking, the field still appreciates the significance of amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, and it's just a matter of maybe, you know, there is a renewed, or not renewed, but an emphasized interest in identifying effective preventative measures for people who, first of all, recognizing if somebody's at risk, and second of all, identifying lifestyle things or, you know, potential like supplements or medications that might be able to, once we identify people who are at risk, to mitigate the likelihood that one will develop Alzheimer's disease. So that's an emphasized area of research. And then also just looking for alternatives to attack. So yeah, but it is tough. I mean, it has been one of those diseases that has been studied for a while. We know a lot about it. And, you know, it's just been this frustratingly elusive disease. Okay, I went to the doctor for the brain. They did this test where they shine a blinking light really quick. That might have been that they were concerned that you might have certain forms of epilepsy. But yeah, I'm not sure. Has folic acid been linked to spina bifida? That's a classic. So wheelie Cody. That's a classic thing that you learn in neuroscience, which is when a woman is pregnant, an insufficient intake of folic acid is directly associated with spina bifida. For anybody that's not familiar with that, spina bifida is a condition that arises when there is incomplete closure of the spinal cord, and so folks like essentially have an exposed nervous system, and it's quite, you know, debilitating, and yeah, it can be significantly mitigated by just supplementing with folic acid, and so that's why, you know, pregnant women, it is recommended that they go on like a prenatal, you know, vitamin of some sort, and you know, that'll be included. Okay, I'm in Philly as well. That's awesome, my beloved Philadelphia. Okay, hello. Insert data. Hi there, Bozic TM, Bozic trademark. Okay, what causes headaches? Well, that is. Honestly, a multi-billion-dollar question. And there are different kinds of headaches, different categories of headaches. One of the, you know, essentially two categories. One is headaches that are brought about by injury, by like actually hitting your head. And another category that is, generally speaking, the broader category into which, you know, like most headaches that you've ever experienced probably fall, which is they arise from not a specific damage event to the head, but something else, some biological cause. And so that is where like cluster headaches, migraines, those types of headaches arise. And the reality is, well, so the sort of one of the kind of prevailing hypotheses for headaches is essentially dysregulation of the vasculature along the meninges. And the meninges are basically like you have your brain and then you have these sort of like layers of shrink wrap around the brain to protect it. And there's no pain receptors within the brain, but there are pain receptors along the outside, you know, around the meninges, including along that vasculature. And so, you know, one of the hypotheses to explain migraines was that for whatever reason, there is something that causes this like dysregulation of vasculature, causing them to dilate or constrict. And that is sort of received by the sensory system as inflammation and therefore painful. And part of the evidence to support that is the sort of frontline treatment for migraines, which are the triptan drugs, which essentially just bind serotonin receptors along the vasculature. They are able to treat successfully migraines in a pretty substantial proportion of people who suffer from migraines. However, they do not treat migraines effectively for everybody. And so there must be something else going on there. One of the recent hypotheses that I saw was it might be the case that in some people there's an overproduction of reactive oxygen species, and then there's this like complicated interaction between different biochemical factors that then causes an activation of pain signaling. And so that is a more recent hypothesis, and there's a medication that's been developed specifically to target that pathway, and it's pretty remarkably effective, called Aimovig. But once again, it's not effective for everybody. And so I don't think I'm going to accept that call. Just, you might want to pick a different handle. And so there's that. There's also an interesting treatment modality that is essentially using Botox. Botulinum, one of the subunits of the botulinum toxin, which, as you're probably more familiar with its use in cosmetic, applications. Basically, what it does is it paralyzes muscles that are responsible for essentially generating wrinkles over a long period of time. It is also used by some celebrities, evidently, in the armpits to prevent sweating from the armpits, which needles near my armpits sounds literally like a nightmare, but it's effective for that. But it turns out that for some people with migraine, a treatment with essentially Botox along certain parts of the head can mitigate migraines pretty substantially. So in any case, we don't know the cause of all headaches. Like the hangover headache, for example, is potentially share some features with the headaches that we experience when we get the flu or, different kind of illnesses. Because it turns out that when somebody drinks a lot of alcohol in one short period of time, there's an immune system reaction. There's an inflammatory reaction. And that may be what causes the headache associated with hangover. Doesn't seem to be the case that it's true, as many people have speculated in the past, that it's just dehydration or insufficient oxygen that causes hangover. It might be part of it, but it could be this inflammatory signaling, which is part of the reason for why, ibuprofen or Tylenol can help to mitigate those headaches, because it interferes with that inflammatory signaling. Multiple causes for headaches. We don't know what causes all of them. So it's complicated. And I say multi-billion-dollar question because a lot, headache is responsible for a very substantial proportion of just like suffering related to biomedical science, and we don't have effective treatments for everybody. Othman says KFUPM, which is a institution in Saudi Arabia, is suspending its schools. Saudi Arabia, all schools are off due to coronavirus. It does seem to be rising pretty rapidly within Middle Eastern countries. There's some pretty startling, reports out of Iran as well. There's a pretty, disturbing video of, I believe, the health minister in Iran, who was making a statement, and he was on a news program, or actually multiple news programs, and he's like visibly suffering. He's like sweating quite a bit. And he's coughing, and it later was reported that he actually was infected with the coronavirus. It's troubling. I mean, there are some schools I know that have closed in certain parts of the United States as well. It's not a widespread phenomenon, but mostly in states that are finding pretty high levels of infection. And by the way, given that we're talking about the coronavirus, I did about 15 minutes on a new study that came out about a potential new treatment for this novel coronavirus that causes a disease we call COVID-19, that doesn't rely on vaccination, which would be a remarkable tool, particularly for folks who are vulnerable to the more severe reactions to this virus, or people who are being, regularly exposed to the virus, particularly if there's, a shortage of things like, the masks that are necessary to prevent exposure in healthcare workers. So you can check that out. You can search for Ian Anthropoid Brain, and you'll probably find it. I can guess which username. Yeah. Are there any damaging effects on the brain from long-term daily cannabis use? Anon 0311 asks. Well, so it really depends upon what you're qualifying as damage. Now, the short response would be there's no evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are neurotoxic in the ways that other recreationally used drugs are. So alcohol, for example, is more neurotoxic than the active ingredients of cannabis, let's say. Now, if you would consider a sort of adverse psychiatric response to cannabis damaging, then there is some evidence that some people, a minority of people, but some people are at risk or at a greater risk of responding with, psychosis, anxiety attacks,
potentially developing schizophrenia than other people. Now, of course, from my perspective, damaging, develop something causing somebody to develop schizophrenia, I think would fall under the umbrella of damaging. But once again, it's a minority of people. The vast majority of people, that is not a likely reaction to cannabis. But, it exists and it's worth acknowledging. There's also evidence that there are long-lasting changes in broad anatomical features of the brain following chronic use of cannabis. So once again, this is not arising from damage to neurons or the death of neurons, which that is essentially a permanent change to the brain because neurons, by and large, never grow back. So once you lose a neuron, it's almost certainly not going to be replaced. So we don't think that that's what's causing these anatomical changes in the brain in people who smoke pot very regularly, but there are changes in what we call white matter to gray matter mass or volume. And what that means, and it was white matter specifically, what that means is that over the long period of time, regular presence of cannabis, regular use of cannabis, regular presence of exogenous cannabinoids seems to alter essentially the types of features of connectivity between neurons that take a long time to develop and to be sculpted by experience and genetics as well. But that and so they will last a long period of time, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily permanent after cessation of use. So I mean, from my perspective, generally speaking, when it comes to the effects of drugs on the brain, anything that has a substantial psychoactive effect, meaning that it has a substantial effect within the brain, over the long term is going to have long-term consequences because the brain is a plastic organ. It adapts to stimuli, and it will, generally speaking, adapt in such a way as to reapproach what we call homeostasis, or what the brain looked like before there was any exposure to any drugs. So that'll be true for pretty much every drug. So from my perspective, the question ought to not be whether or not cannabis is damaging to the brain or whether or not cannabis induces long-term changes in the brain. Rather, it should be, we should, compare apples to apples and evaluate whether or not those changes are more or less toxic than drugs that we, broadly speaking, recognize as ought to be legal, and adults ought to be in the position to determine whether or not they want to use them. Alcohol, or tobacco, nicotine. And from that perspective, I think there's really no justification in biomedical science for making cannabis illegal and alcohol legal. Okay. Good question. Hello there, mate. I was wondering, is there any differences between gay male brain and straight? Well, it's an interesting topic. I mean, broadly speaking, there is a difference between your brain and my brain, even if we're both straight, even if you share my ancestry. Thank you very much for the super hearts, Asha. I really appreciate it. And Sherry, sorry I didn't see that. Thank you for the super hearts. I appreciate it. Very generous of you. And even if I had, I have siblings, there are differences between our brains, even though we're rather closely related, more closely related than you or I, assuming that there's not some kind of interesting, weird, unknown connection between us. And then even if I had a fraternal twin, meaning, two different, more of our genetics is shared than typical siblings. Even if I had a fraternal twin, there would be differences between our brains. And even if I had an identical twin, meaning our genome is, for all intents and purposes, identical, the same. Even if I had an identical twin, there would be minor and fewer than with a fraternal twin, but minor differences between our brains because we will have experienced different life experiences. We will have, ingested different quantities of drugs, of alcohol or whatever. We will have experienced different kinds of trauma or a lack thereof. We will have been treated by our peers in slightly different ways. All of these things will have an effect on, differences in the brains of different people. So what you're asking is, does sexual preference correlate with a consistent difference between heterosexual and homosexual individuals? And so, I mean, inevitably that the answer to that is going to be yes, because there is a consistent difference in sexual preference, right? And so, you will see a difference in, brain reactions to, showing different, members of different genders to somebody who's homosexual versus heterosexual. So, I mean, the short answer is yes, but the caveat to that answer is that that's not a particularly interesting finding or notion, because you already knew going in that there was a different reaction, right? And sexual attraction is quite complicated in humans, and so there will be similarities and some minor differences. So yeah, but it's worth noting that in primates and in humans in particular, sexual attraction is a really, it's not the most intuitive biological phenomenon. Okay. Hello, Ian. What part of the brain believes in God or Allah and Buddha, etc.? I'm sure that there have been cognitive neuroscience studies. I know that there have been cognitive neuroscience studies of religiosity or trying to evaluate the sort of substrate for spirituality. But it's not going to be, the way the brain works, it's not like there is a specific part of the brain that is what causes you to prefer, lobster over shrimp, right? It's not like there's a specific brain region that is responsible for that. It emerges from a collection of different brain regions all collaborating to encode that preference. It's not going to just be one specific brain region. And you might find articles online where, a journalist will say the brain region for religion has been identified. And that is almost without exception going to be an oversimplification of what any study quantified. But yeah, these brain regions will be ones that are associated with, memory of past experience, of, just belief in general. And probably some, affiliation, social affiliation. So yeah. Okay. I didn't realize it at the time, but thinking back, I knew I had it. Oh, wow. I was sick last week with a fairly high fever, 102 degrees, and I think I hallucinated. Can you speak to that? Wow. I'm sorry. Well, I assume you've recovered at least somewhat. So yeah, definitely fevers can be associated with hallucination. It's not particularly common. And Elizabeth, I realize I don't know exactly how old you are, but I do know that you have a large family, and so I assume you're a bit older than me at least. And so, reactions to any kind of infection can be more severe. Generally, 102, it's nothing to sneeze at, but it's not like the highest fever that one could experience. And so, but yeah, it's certainly possible. I actually, I have looked to see if there have been any characterizations of what it is that causes hallucination in, you're not that much older than I am. And I don't think that there has been any characterization of the changes in the brain that occur in response to a fever. And, a fever is just an indication of inflammatory signaling, contrary to, I think, what is very commonly believed, fevers themselves are not actually life-threatening. Just the elevated temperature is not actually what's life-threatening. It is just a sign of what's going on in the body. That's sort of an indication of the sort of the immune status of a person. And I only say that because I think when somebody has a fever, there is this rush to bring that temperature down. And it's not, that's not necessarily the most of prime importance, let's say. So I guess, yeah, the short response is that, people can have certainly hallucinations during, fever. It's less common, I would imagine it's less common at that temperature. And, age will play a factor. And unfortunately, I can't tell you why those hallucinations occur. I could speculate, but that's all it would be. I was awake but had weird repetitive thoughts. Oh, that's interesting. I'm not sure that, I assume, that's just something else that you experience. Yeah, so rumination. There have been studies that, I bring this up all the time because it was a study that was done at Penn where I did my PhD, that basically showed, elevations of inflammatory signaling associated with an immune response to, some infection can be associated with changes in parts of the brain that we know are associated with things like serotonin production. And, we know serotonin plays a significant role in regulating mood and depression. And you can induce depressive-like behavior in animal models by doing so, or by elevating those factors in those brain regions. And so, one could imagine that, particularly, if you're talking about things like rumination, perseveration, in other words, just like being caught in, just sort of like a thought spiral, a thought cycle, generally speaking, about things that are aversive and, like that make you feel bad. That is a classic symptom of depression and, mood-related psychiatric conditions. And so, but yeah, unfortunately, I can't like pinpoint precisely how. But it's a really interesting thought. Yeah, I'll have to take another look. It's been a while since I've looked for that connection. It's that man again. Hey, what's up? Can you tell your brain to stop overthinking? Well, funny enough, we were just talking about that, rumination. So, one of the like sort of interesting features of human psychology and the brain that generates it is that it is not an engine of rationality. And while you do have some say in the matter of what you speak or of what you think about, you're actually not in control of that. Or the thing to which you refer to as you is not in control of that. You're sort of at the whim of essentially a train of cognition that bubbles up through your subconscious processes into your conscious awareness. And you have, because you're largely unaware of your subconscious, you have the sensation that like, I'm deciding to think about this thing now, but that's actually not how the signaling works, at least. And so, unfortunately, at least some of the research I've seen that tries to, anatomically pinpoint the distinction between parts of the brain that generate rumination or generate perseveration, repetitive thoughts, oftentimes associated with parts of the brain that are associated with obsessive compulsive disorder. And of course, repetitive thoughts, again, perseveration, rumination, are symptoms, classic symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder. Unfortunately, those parts of the brain are not within the purview of conscious awareness. And so, there are different strategies that people can employ to try and train yourself to get better at controlling your, train of cognition. Particularly, that is like essentially the goal of mindfulness meditation. And I could go into mindfulness meditation a little bit more deeply, but what I would recommend is that there are tons of free resources online and free guided meditations. I know Sam Harris, the writer, I guess is what he would call himself now, put out a free guided meditation used for mindfulness. There's also transcendental meditation, or TM. That is a more expensive alternative to mindfulness meditation, and they share some features, but not they're not identical. But in any case, yeah, I would check those out. It is totally unintuitive, trying to control your train of thoughts, but at least you can, it's sort of like working out a muscle. You can begin to recognize what's happening and potentially exercise some agency in that train. So the baby's back from her walk. So if you hear any adorable utterances, that is her. Okay. No, I wanted to answer my question. Hope he scrolls up and answers. So, sure. Smiley J. Let's see. Hi, just joined. Welcome. I have a question. Is depression real, or is it all in our heads and made up? Because my parents think it's made up. Well, Smiley J, that is a great topic. So first of all, yes, it's real. That there's, it's real from the perspective of somebody like me, a neuroscientist who studies anxiety and mood-related signaling at a cellular level. It's also real from the perspective of clinicians, psychiatrists, and psychologists, because, and there are multiple reasons that they would consider it to be real, because folks who are depressed tend to present or manifest, consistent symptoms. So, there are some differences between people who are depressed, differences in what caused the depression, differences in life experiences. Interestingly, there are likely some differences in genetic vulnerabilities and resiliencies. But generally speaking, when something is added to the DSM-5, which is sort of like the Bible of psychiatry, it is because there are a large statistical foundation that identifies similar people suffering from similar symptoms that respond to similar treatments, right? And so, yes, it's real. Now, if and you know, you're not alone in interacting with folks who believe it's not real. That's very common, or in people who kind of underestimate the severity of psychiatric conditions. And I think that it's pretty understandable why, particularly for people who've never suffered from a psychiatric illness. And it's because there's no outward, you know, massive anatomical change associated with this condition. You know, like there is when you break a bone, for example. It's very obvious. You can see it. Or even when you have diabetes, we can measure a specific molecule or, you know, a handful of molecules and show, you have very radically different levels of insulin or circulating glucose. That's diabetes. When it comes to depression, there almost certainly are going to be consistent differences in things like, you know, neurotransmitter levels. But unfortunately, we can't pinpoint what that molecular signature of depression is. So that is the sort of the difficulty that folks in my position encounter. But, you know, suffice it to say that from a clinical perspective, you know, you know, medicine has recognized depression as a real thing. From a scientific perspective, which is my wheelhouse, it's definitely a studyable, right, condition. In humans, animals exhibit similar manifestations of depression-like behavior, and so yeah, it's absolutely real. Oh, and then, you know, another consideration is that rates of suicide in the United States are increasing. They're at the highest levels, I believe, ever in the history of the country, and you know, there are multiple potential explanations for that. But one explanation is that, you know, depression is a primary cause of suicide, and untreated depression is a, you know, potentially life-threatening condition. So yes, now I know I didn't arm you with like precisely the ammunition that you would need to convince your parents that it's real. I don't even know if that's your goal. But suffice it to say that in that argument, you have, you know, physicians on your side, you know, clinical science on your side, and you have neuroscience on your side. So yeah, pasta. Yeah, that's one of her favorite foods. So she loves pasta, and so we got her to eat some more vegetables. Or is it a fruit? Is zucchini a fruit? I think it is a fruit. Some zucchini pasta. Big tip. Kids seem to love pasta for some reason. Zucchini pasta. Try it out. All right. Is demonic possession real or a mental disorder? Billy the Kid. Super interesting topic. So in I believe the 16th century, folks who would experience uncontrollable convulsions, or uncontrollable, you know, absence of consciousness, or they lose the ability to stand and contract their muscles. They, again, 16th century, the sort of leading theory, medical theory, of that was that they were possessed by demons or that they were a witch. And the solution was to put them to death, unfortunately. Not the best treatment, I would argue. It does effectively reduce the convulsions, but the way that they would test whether or not somebody was possessed by a demon or a witch, one of the ways, was to read them the story of the crucifixion of, you know, Jesus Christ. And if they failed to cry in response to being told this story, they were considered to be possessed by a demon, and therefore put to death. Now, interestingly, at around the 16th century, a really, you know, progressive physician of the time, he said, well, wait a second. We know that particularly as some women get older, their lacrimal glands, which are, you know, necessary for producing tears, they can atrophy, and therefore they can lose the ability to cry. Like physically, they can't cry, and maybe they would be crying, but we know this anatomy. We know that, you know, they can't cry. So, you know, let's hold off a little bit. At least on some cases, they might not be possessed by a demon, but might be, you know, producing incapable of producing tears. So, of course, the condition to which I was referring is epilepsy. You know, convulsions. You know, one of the conditions that's based in the brain that's been studied for among the longest periods of time. Epilepsy, believe it or not, is a pretty old field. And it's been studied for a long time, and some of the early theories of it were that you were possessed by a demon. We now know, of course, that that's not the case, at least generally speaking, that they're not possessed by demons. But that is the sort of like the relationship between explaining some malady as a demonic possession and finding a biological substrate for that purported demonic possession. As science advances, we can find specific biological substrates for a lot of these conditions. So far be it from me to suggest that, to suggest that I have any awareness of spirituality, theology, than, somebody who actually does have that experience. But generally speaking, I think that, that as we understand more and more about the basic biology of the brain, things that might appear to us as being metaphysical, it's like such a disturbance or such a disturbance in a person, that there must be some kind of metaphysical, spiritual cause. As we learn more and more about the various parts of the body that underlie that aberrant behavior, we'll be able to explain more and more. Yeah. It's an interesting story. There's an interesting history there. I forgot what book I read that, or in what book I read that. That's so frustrating. It might have been The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, which is a great book for people who are not scientists. It's written for the non-scientists. Ian, you're smart as F. How can it be like you? Well, Hyperman, I am actually no smarter than you are. Believe me, I this is not false modesty. I know, I have evidence that I am no smarter than, people in general. The difference between you and me, at least in this moment, is that I've devoted the better part of almost a decade to studying the brain specifically. So it is my job to know a lot about the brain. Bring me outside of my wheelhouse and I am useless, right? And so, I'm not smarter than you. I was able to find a way to devote a significant amount of my time and my attention and frankly, my emotion to learning about this subject than most people even have the privilege of doing. So, it's just a matter of time and interest, and you can appear as smart as I appear, but I promise you it's not because I'm any more intelligent than any of you. Okay. Watch your acid reflux, sir. Yeah, no kidding. My favorite. What's up, Pitbull guy? Oh, really? Yeah, you like zucchini? The other thing that we're going to try out is spaghetti squash. Yeah, we're going to see. The baby digs noodles. What can I say? Really been enjoying the CBD on my brain. Brother Dank. Brother Dank. Brother Brain over here. CBD, cannabidiol, it doesn't seem to exert the majority of its effects, believe it or not, in the brain. The majority of the effects of CBD seem to converge on the periphery, the peripheral nervous system. And actually, not just the nervous system. There are cannabinoid receptors on immune system cells. There are some interesting anecdata that suggest that CBD may be effective in helping people who are experiencing anxiety. And, there's some interesting science to be done there. If I had my own lab, I would certainly, entertain the notion that I might study that because it indicates that here would be my hypothesis about that. First of all, either CBD does exert some effect with some, as of yet, unidentified effect within the central nervous system, and therefore influences anxiety, and what's a little bit more alluring to me is that there might be some peripheral component of anxiety that is at least underappreciated as of today. Cannabidiol, it's receiving a lot of attention recently, and it does seem to have some pretty substantial clinical benefit for some people. However, I'm a little bit apprehensive, or I'm a little bit concerned that there's a little bit too much exaggeration of its utility. Doesn't have to cure everything to be a useful or even just pleasant. It doesn't have to have some kind of clinical benefit to justify you taking it. If it makes you feel better and you don't have any kind of malady, that's great. That's why people drink coffee. Hello, opinion of DMT. I don't have a lot of opinions about DMT, but I do find it to be a fascinating molecule. Dimethyltryptamine, a chemical cousin to serotonin. It, therefore, because of its similarity to serotonin, is capable of interacting with a lot of things in the brain with which serotonin interacts. And because serotonin is one of the biggest signaling systems within the central nervous system, it regulates everything from mood to cognition, your thought processes, to memory, to energy, to libido, to appetite. All of these things are at least influenced by serotonin signaling. But probably the most interesting component of DMT pharmacology, neuropharmacology, is the fact that serotonin regulates sensory perception. And that is the reason why when somebody ingests DMT, either when they eat it with an MAOI or when they smoke it, that is why you have this profound alteration of consciousness that not only includes cognition, not only includes changes in mood, but it also includes literally perceptual changes. And that's fascinating to me. It's also one reason that dimethyltryptamine, there are different, dimethyltryptamine is considered to be a psychedelic hallucinogen. And there's a reason that we categorize a lot of these hallucinogens as psychedelic versus other kinds of hallucinogens that are not psychedelic. So for example, mescaline, LSD, as Billy the Kid brings up, that's right, LSD, mescaline, LSD, psilocybin, which is actually quite closely related to dimethyltryptamine, DMT. And then, I literally have, I should get those books out because I think it would be interesting to people who are interested in neuropharmacology. There are 2 tomes that were written by a sorcerer, essentially, a medicinal chemist, but really a sorcerer, named Alexander Shulgin, sometimes called Sasha Shulgin. And he has an extraordinarily unique and interesting backstory. He, I believe, worked at Dow Chemical, and he was the only human, I think the only human outside of the intelligence community that had permission from the government to synthesize all of these psychedelic hallucinogens. And, it's literally, he made thousands of them and tested a lot of them, he and his friends. And he basically kept a diary of them. So, they're really fascinating books. They're sort of like cult classics. But anyways, the reason we call all of these many, many, many molecule psychedelic hallucinogens is because they all share some pharmacological feature, which is influencing the serotonin signaling system, and particularly influencing the 5-HT2A subtype, serotonin receptor. But they all also influence other serotonin receptors and neurotransmitter trafficking proteins, DAT, SERT, NET, norepinephrine transporter, dopamine transporter, serotonin transporter, and so on. They all will influence all those monoaminergic proteins. And that is why they share more features of their effects with each other than they do with, let's say, ketamine. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic, but at high doses, it induces pretty substantial hallucinations that are pretty different in subjective quality compared to DMT or LSD or so on. And that is different from, let's say, diphenhydramine, which is an over-the-counter drug, which is a deliriant hallucinogen. So it also induces hallucinations. They're just completely different from psychedelic hallucinations. They are delirium. So you're literally imagining people. You're seeing people that are not there, which is pretty alarming. And so ketamine has primarily glutamatergic pharmacology. It influences the NMDA receptor. Diphenhydramine is largely cholinergic. So it's a little bit maybe more similar to Amanita muscaria mushrooms. Anyways, so that's my opinion on DMT. There's a lot to learn from this family of chemicals. So yeah. Do brains poop? Yeah, they kind of do. Depends on, how forgiving a definition of poop and fecal matter you are willing to take on. But the brain produces waste. Neurons are extraordinarily metabolically active. The brain consumes about 20 to 25% of your caloric intake. Think about that. 20 to 25%. And it's about a 3-pound mass that fits inside my rather capacious skull. Yours is about the same size. And it just sits there. It doesn't do anything other than produce consciousness. Well, it does other things, regulates physiological processes, but it's not moving. It's not literally physically influencing, the physical world like your muscles do. My quadricep muscles or my pectoral muscles are much larger than my brain, but the brain alone consumes more than any one of those muscles itself. And given that it consumes, these neurons consume all of this caloric energy, there are waste byproducts of all that caloric activity, and that waste has to be removed from the brain, believe it or not. We have a garbage collection system called the glymphatic system. And by the way, just a little interesting feature of the glymphatic system. So the glymphatic system is basically just, you can think of it as sort of like a pressure water cleaner of neurons, just scooping up and removing all of the metabolic byproducts, the waste of the brain. And that system is far more active when you're sleeping than when you're awake. It's active when you're awake, but there's a beautiful study that was, again, done at my beloved University of Pennsylvania that showed it is way more active when you sleep. And so therefore, it doesn't strain credulity to claim that it is very likely the case that sleep deprivation is associated with insufficient clearance of metabolic byproducts. So yeah, I could go on and on about that. It's an interesting topic. And it looks like we're potentially going to be connecting. Yes, it looks like we've connected. So what's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there?
Hi.
Tenta Curly, what's your name and where are you calling from?
My name is Alexander.
Alexander, where are you calling from?
Yeah, I come from French.
Awesome, from France. What's on your mind, Alexander?
What?
What's on your mind? What are you thinking about?
About what?
About the brain. So I am a neuroscientist, and I like to, I have conversations about the brain, consciousness, dreams, déjà vu, which we appreciate the use of that French term. So yeah.
Speak about one thing. I can speak what I want.
Okay, and what is that?
Okay, I'm French. I speak French, but I come from island between Madagascar and between Mauritius. Okay, and I'm going to tell quickly. I'm here for practice English on Lyon, but could you give me tips for Lyon better?
Yeah. That's a really interesting topic. Well, first of all, you're doing you're very impressive. Your English is already doing pretty good. I think what you're doing right now, I mean, obviously you're in France. I assume there's plenty of people who do speak English in France, but the quickest way to learn a language is immersion, is going to an area where you're surrounded by people who speak the language, where you're kind of forced to learn, as rapidly as possible the language to pick it up. That is one of the best things you can do. Literally for example, I was trying to learn Chinese for a while, and because I was preparing to go visit China. And I did learn, a fair number of words. But the reality was that until I was in China and in a situation where I needed to speak Chinese, I wasn't really learning the language. So that would be, my number one suggestion would be, if you're near somewhere that speaks English, that's what I would suggest. But listen, Alexander, I'm sorry to say that it looks like our call is disrupting our conversation here. So thank you so much for calling in. I appreciate it. Okay, now let's see. Yeah, sometimes I think the callers can disrupt the audio. So let me know if the audio is still a little bit messed up. Yeah, I just got a notification. Coming in and out fixes audio issues. Good to go now. Okay, that's unfortunate. Thank you, guys. We use ketamine on some people in the ER for conscious sedation, putting a dislocated limb back. Yeah, so, Swamp A. That's a pretty funny handle for somebody that works in the ER. But yeah, ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. What's really handy about ketamine, as opposed to analgesics like, oxycodone or fentanyl or whatever, is that all of those two drugs that I just mentioned, they suppress the respiratory rhythm. So when somebody dies from an overdose of heroin or fentanyl, it is because they've stopped breathing. It's not actually because I live in Florida, so it gets swampy in the summer down here. I got it. I used to live in Florida, and believe me, I empathize. Same with Houston, too. Houston, I think at times is even worse. But in any case, yeah, so ketamine does not suppress the respiratory rhythm. And so, the risk of a fatal overdose is much lower than... my daughter's learned how to say hello or hi. It's so cute. And she's also learned how to say bye. Oh. But yeah, that's one of the reasons why ketamine is such a useful medication. It also very recently, unless if you're unaware, has been shown to be potentially useful for the treatment of depression, which is pretty exciting. What is the light people see when they're nearly dead? Is it Jesus or the brain shutting down? Well, once again, I don't have the expertise to speak to any potential spiritual component to those experiences. It's just not what I study. What I can tell you, however, is, that is sort of consistently identified, not always, but by folks who, were near death. Once again, a near-death experience means that they did not die. Right? They survived. And there is a very important biological difference between dying and not dying, right? There was something about their biology that enabled them to recover. Okay, so part of what's happening as, the brain is shutting down, let's say, whether it's, insufficient delivery of blood to the brain or some kind of hypoxia for some other reason, a stroke or whatever, activity. So generally speaking, what will happen is parts of the brain that are important for social interaction, for memory, for conscious awareness even, but are not critical to sustain life, they will tend to shut down first. That includes sensory systems, and essentially the last brain regions to go, and this is very broad generalizations, but generally speaking, the last brain regions to suffer the consequences of near death are parts of the brain that are necessary for breathing, for regulating cardiovascular rhythm, for those very, very basic life-sustaining activities. And so as a result, you can imagine, you can almost experience this like in real time, right? So your occipital lobe is all the way out here. Well, it's all the way back here, and the visual cortex is all the way back here. Pretty distal from those very, those regions of the brain that are necessary to sustain life, once again, respiratory rhythm, pretty far away. And so as the delivery of oxygen to these neurons declines, you can imagine it's almost like like tunnel vision. And part of those neurons that are going to endure that insufficient oxygen delivery and blood delivery, blood perfusion, will be visual neurons. And those, therefore, are neurons that are functioning in an altered state. Right? It's not an altered state that would be enjoyable necessarily, but because those neurons are the neurons that are responsible for encoding vision, because they are among the ones that are being altered by that deprivation of blood delivery of oxygen, you're going to experience changes in your vision. And so as a result, that's one of the reasons, at least in some cases, why, people can experience tunnel vision, when they're about to pass out or when they're in like those what are they called? Those like flight tester, gyroscopes essentially, where they spin you around at like different G's. You can basically watch it happen. And part of the reason that people, I suggest you check it out on YouTube. It's kind of disturbing, but I have a friend who is a fighter pilot in the Air Force, and yeah, like they have to go through this training, right? Particularly if you're flying like certain kinds of planes. He flew really cool jets. I actually have to catch back up with him. But anyways, what's literally happening is that, blood has mass, and as you're going at certain G's, like you're literally pulling blood to certain parts of the brain, and therefore you just get this tunnel vision until you're out. And so a near-death experience will share some features with that. I want to see, okay. Let's see. Thoughts on the potential to upload mechanical digital entity. Flora Dave. Well, it's a broad topic. I have a podcast called Wired to be Weird, and we did talk about whole brain computer interfaces. We touched on Elon Musk's new company, Neuralink, and we touched on whether or not it's possible to upload your consciousness, essentially download your consciousness from your brain and upload it onto a silicon-based life form to a computer. And so the short story is, while consciousness is extraordinarily complicated and the relationship between the brain and consciousness is, extremely complicated and it has not been fully enumerated, it still arises from physical events in the brain that obey the laws of physics. And computers also obey the laws of physics. And so, so it's purely theoretical, but the only thing preventing us from generating some kind of replication of a consciousness is a lack of knowledge, right? It's just manipulating the laws of physics in a way that delivers our intended output. And so, there's some interesting philosophical questions there. Like, for example, if somebody were to just come in and download my consciousness, and we could even talk about hypothetical ways that you might potentially do that. But let's say that they were to do that, and then they uploaded it to a computer. One question is, would I, my current self, the thing to which I refer to as myself, would I notice that? Like, would there be a coherent transition, or would it be more like if somebody were to clone me, right? Where, somebody were to literally replicate the relative positions of every single atom in my body, but then just create a new one, we would have two different consciousnesses, right? Kind of similar to like an identical twin. So it's not like I would be able to have some kind of like Borg-like control over both bodies. That's just a remarkably similar consciousness to mine. And so, that's what I would expect if one were to download or upload your consciousness to a computer, is that, the story for that consciousness, for my consciousness there, would end there, and then we would immediately diverge, right, into two different consciousnesses. But yeah, so theoretically, there's no like, at least as of yet, there has been no like components of consciousness that do not obey the laws of physics as we understand them. So given that, there's no strong argument for why we wouldn't be able to do that. Just say kurwa. We are all in this S. I don't know what you mean by that. Kurwa. That was a comment on YouTube. Don't listen to him, Ian. Okay, mind meld Spock and Kirk. Yeah, right. In the future, could people be brought back from the dead, like the Frankenstein theory? The Frankenstein, you mean, well, so in the story of Frankenstein, so first of all, the monster was not named Frankenstein. As I'm sure you all are aware, it was Dr. Frankenstein's monster. Dr. Frankenstein has endured slander for long enough. The monster, Dr. Frankenstein, different people. But anyways, like the Frankenstein's monster was the byproduct of a sort of mosaic of different body parts put together and then animated using magic, essentially, or electricity, actually. So could you make a human that way? I mean, again, super theoretically, potentially, but it would be the sort of worst way to go about doing it. So let's take maybe a more intuitive urban legend, which is, Walt Disney had his brain preserved, cryogenically frozen, so that upon the inception of some kind of medical innovation that enables us to take a brain, put it in something, and then enable it to, turn the lights back on. So there's that, right? There is no good reason to believe that you will be able to reanimate that brain, where like the lights are out, you're put in a cryogenic tank, and then the lights are back on. There's no good reason to believe that would be possible without some really amazing and totally unforeseen innovations in biomedical science. Another sort of example of this, though, or at least let's say an adjacent topic, is the effort to develop the capacity to do a head transplant. Okay, so here's here's how you might articulate how that would work. So, you are, let's say, in your mid 70s, maybe early 80s, and your mind is fine, it's intact, you haven't suffered any kind of age-related degeneration, neurodegenerative diseases or anything like that. But unfortunately, your body is just not keeping up. And so, but hey, you want to live longer, and you have plenty of cash. You'd have to be pretty wealthy for this to happen, I would imagine. And so you find somebody whose only problem was in their brain and their body's totally fine. And you pay for some, evil scientists or evil physicians, surgeons, to do a head transplant. So your head with the healthy brain is put onto a body that's healthy from a person whose brain was diseased. And as macabre as that sounds, that was attempted, or I should say, that was proposed to happen. I think now towards the end of 2018, by an Italian neurosurgeon named Sergio Canavero and a team of Chinese surgeons. Most of the team was Chinese. And they had successfully, so Sergio Canavero, well, I should say, other teams have successfully transplanted the heads of certain animals, which is a little bit disturbing. In fact, way back when, I tweeted out one of the pictures from a study where a group had attached a second head to a rat. It looks just as freaky as it sounds, honestly. And the second head lived for a while, and they euthanized this subject, and that was part of their plan. They weren't. The goal was not to see how long it would survive, rather if it just could. And I should say that kind of a study would never be permitted to happen in the United States. I can't remember where that was done, but we don't do that kind of science here in the United States. There have also, way back in the day, there have been successful head transplants between non-human primates. They've never lived for a long period of time, however. It's disturbing. It's definitely disturbing stuff. It's also been done with a dog, and there are certain. It does move its face a little bit after the transplant, but it's unclear as to whether or not those were just reflexive, whether or not those movements were encoded by the brain or something else. And it was almost certainly not the brain. Okay. Now, this team, Sergio Canavero and the team of, I think I'm starting to come to allergy season. But anyways, they made the claim that not only were they going to successfully do a head transplant, but that they had successfully done it between cadavers. And the most important word there is cadaver. And so there was not a living, example, but they claimed that they not only were going to do it in a living person, but that they had volunteers for it. And I don't know if you've noticed, but we haven't heard of any successful head transplants between humans. So evidently they were unsuccessful. I don't know if it was even attempted, but but all of that said, and I could go into like the biology behind why Sergio Canavero thinks that he's going to be able to do this. Suffice it to say, I am not impressed. But let's say with more completed neuroscience, could you be able to do that in the future? I think so, yes. It would be extraordinarily difficult, and you'd have to have some as of yet unreceived innovations in biomedical science for it to be successful, but it would be possible. I know that was a long tangent there, but let's keep it PG in here. Huh? Yes, thank you, folks. I really appreciate you guys helping out with the moderating. Is it true that marijuana is smoked on a regular basis will create holes in your brain? Wildlife. No, that is not true. At least there's no evidence that that's the case. And in fact, there was a story that came out way back in the day that MDMA caused there to be holes in the brain. And there was even some brain scans that were presented as evidence of these holes. And it turns out that even that story, and by the way, I should say, like, it would make more sense that a drug like MDMA or a psychomotor stimulant would be able to generate substantial neurotoxicity. But I should say also that it turned out that study was not entirely fraudulent, but there was a lot of falsification of data in that study. So even the claim that MDMA puts holes in your brain is a misconception. There's no evidence that cannabis causes any neurotoxicity, which would be the only way for there to be holes in your brain caused by a drug. But as I said earlier, there is evidence that there are some long-term changes in the brain that arise from cannabis use. But we still don't know just how permanent they are, and quite likely they're not permanent. Okay. let's see. It looks like we should be connecting fairly soon. Hopefully the audio isn't disrupted as it was last time. It looks like we might be having trouble connecting. Well, we'll keep trying, and